Welcome to ACF Chefs Forum. We're excited to have experts here with information just for you, the leaders and future leaders of the food service industry. You're in for a real treat today as we have an amazing presenter who will be sharing information on modern baking techniques. So a big thank you to our association partners at Retail Bakers of America for bringing us this much needed and much appreciated educational opportunity. I'm Jackie Pressinger, American Culinary Federation's Director for Strategic Partnerships, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's special session. Today we'll be taking questions for our featured chef presenter live during the webinar as we're able. So please use the chat function to collaborate with other chefs, bakers, and students tuning in, and the Q&A function to ask questions to the chef. Okay, so let's get that discussion going in the chat. If you haven't already, please let us know where you're tuning in from today. And at this time, please join me in welcoming Chef Marissa Veely, the Certification and Education Director at Retail Bakers of America, to kick off this webinar and introduce today's special guest. Thank you, Chef.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Jackie, for the introduction. And thank you for the ACF for collaborating with the Retail Bakers of America on this great resource, the ChefsForum webinar. We are so excited to be here. For those who are not familiar with the RBA, we're the National Association for Retail Bakers, Bakery Owners, Cake Decorators, and Educators. It's our goal to offer meaningful education, resources, and networking opportunities to help support the growth of the retail baking industry. I am so excited to have here with us Chef Richard Chapentier, one of RBA's certified master bakers and the CEO of his consulting company, Baking Innovation. Richard is a classically trained French baker, and he comes to us with over 3 decades of experience in the baking industry, from retail bakeries all the way to the commercial side of manufacturing. He also has experience in R&D and has helped launch several branded bakery products. Richard is not only a baker, but he is also a wealth of knowledge and a true scholar when it comes to the science and history of flours and grains. So I will hand it off to Chef Richard so he can share with you his knowledge of whole grains and the benefits of baking with whole grains as well. So Chef Richard, I will turn it to you.
Good afternoon or good morning for some of you located elsewhere. So thank you very much for the introduction, Marissa. So as stated, I am Richard Chapentier, CMB. I'm a bakery scientist and avid food historian, love the history of food. So hopefully I can today during that webinar section help you make better decision when using flour. So today, the topic that I'd like to introduce you to is whole grain flour. And whole grain flour can be part of your next innovation, whether or not you're a smaller restaurant or you're a larger food service chefs working for a larger kitchen. I think there's a huge demand in statistics showing that people are looking for different options, and let me take you through that today. So let's get to sharing the screen with you. So today we will be talking on the innovation through whole grain. So through the presentation, we'll go through the types of grain, what is a wheat kernel, the composition of a wheat kernel, and some certain definition of grains that we hear. So hopefully we'll all be better educated after the session. So this is, same as the previous slide. So I know we hear that, there's a lot of different types of grain. When it comes to baking, I always encourage any potential aspiring bakers or in restaurants, we tend to rely on wheat. But did you know, there are other grains that we can bake with or add a % of? When it comes to baking, similarly to cooking, we're using different ingredients to get different flavors. And what I've learned over the years is by blending different grains together, we get different results, which is the basis of good innovation. And as consumers looking for better for you options, hopefully I can guide you through that. So let's take a look at the different type of grains that we can use today. So within the first category would be cereal grains. We all used to, buying cereal at the grocery store, and that's where the name comes from. Grains can be coming from cereal, and if you look, wheat is the grain that is known the most consumed in the US. You can get rice as a grain. It is a grain. Corn is also a grain. Oats, barley, rye, and some really small, more obscure like canary seeds, fonio, millet, triticale, sorghum, teff, and job steers. And now you can look them up, and they're all within the family of cereals. So then you have the pseudo cereals, which they're not cereal by definition of the Whole Grain Council. You have the amaranth, buckwheat, quinoa, and then you have all of your legumes, which would be more of, they're not nuts, but flax seeds, chia, sunflower, soybean, and all of those are falling under the umbrella of grains. And as you can see, such a lot of different ingredients to play with in order to create your new bread. So, but let's go back to what is a whole grain? A whole grain is the grain that contains the entire part of the seed or the kernel. And usually most of the grains contain three major parts: the endosperm, which is basically where most of the carbohydrates is being contained, the bran, which is the outer envelope of the grain, of the wheat kernel, and the wheat germ, which is, if left if left with water, it will start sprouting back from the germ, and that's where sprouted grains are being made, or malt. And if the grain is at any point processed, as it says, cracked, rolled, extruded, or cooked, it should remain in the same amount. So whole grain, if you want to make a whole grain, you cannot just buy white flour and say, I'm going to buy some bran and some germ and mix it together. It's under the definition, it would not be considered a whole grain, especially if you have a label on your packaging. So that's why there's a very standardized definition of what a whole grain is. So let's take a closer look. What are whole grain and why they're great? As you can see, by removing most of the flour we buy, we're removing the bran and the germ portion. Most of the millers today are focusing on the wheat kernel, the portion that is called the endosperm. That is where most of the energy, and energy meaning carbohydrate, and carbohydrates meaning sugar. So if left unattended, the plant will use that energy and keep on sprouting to grow another plant. Well, no wonder why it makes the best bread, because it has most of the energy needed for the plant, but also the energy for us. But with having the whole grain, you're having the benefits of the halo of better for you, which is quite trendy now, where consumers looking for different options. So the bran has a lot of fiber, also called dietary fiber. And I'm sure, with all the conversation on microbiome and gut health, a lot of people are saying, hey, we need dietary fiber. So that's why whole grains are very important for everyday nutrition, as they bring up a lot of the different fiber, B vitamins, minerals, and phytonutrients necessary for a healthy nutrition and a healthy growth. And the germ is loaded with phytonutrients and vitamins, in vitamin E and unsaturated fats, which is very good. So that's why next time you get an option of saying whole grain versus the regular white flour, think about it again. But we're going through the baking portion on the section 3. So here is a picture. I'll let you look at it again. The whole grains is the entire grain, then that's going to be milled. And if a lot of confusion, even if you look at rye, which is not here, a lot of rye, if you want a whole rye, it's often referred to as pumpernickel. And it's very void of gluten, very difficult to make bread. But as long as you have a base of wheat, whole wheat flour, it's very easy to incorporate different whole grains to create different flavors. Think of it as fermentation process in the crafting of beer making. A lot of the different grains are mixed with different flavors to create different results. The same process is true to bread baking. It's a fermentation process that will degrade some of through enzymatic reaction and through yeast fermentation that would create a finished product that makes it unique to what you're creating. Another definition that we hear is called staple grains or refined grains. So what are refined grains? A lot of the bakers or pizza shops or restaurants do buy flour, and they tend to buy refined grains. A refined grain is a wheat flour where, as mentioned earlier, where most of the bran and the germ have been removed, along with most of the fiber, vitamins and minerals and other phytonutrients during the milling process. And often those flours will come with enrichment. The enrichment will come in by FDA standards. You'll see it on the bag. It'll say, thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, folic acid, iron, and calcium optional. And I always encourage in today, and again, I'm a baker, not a doctor, but you get better nutrition from a whole grain than having fortified flour where it's being added back to it. So, and I always encourage for all of those listening to check of the type of enrichment or that is in your flour. A lot of the flour being used today for, bagged flour still do contain potassium bromate, which is an ingredient that is banned in most of the countries, except in the US. It helps. It's a strong oxidizing agent, and we're not here to talk about it. Or some of the flour also will be bleached with benzoyl peroxide, and it says bleach. Just check your ingredients as consumers are being more aware and more sensitive to clean label ingredients. So it's good education for you to start looking, and I always do it with all of my friends who are chefs to make sure that they're using the right flour. And remember, enrichment of flour, like you see the fortification of flour, does not replace all of the nutrients being removed during the milling process. So now we're talking about whole grains, the different types of whole grain, sort of the different nutritional and what the available flour, the definition of whole grain, refined flour. Now, but why do we need whole grain? So the health benefits of whole grain. If you look today in the US, we are not eating enough whole grain. Most of the products we make are being made from refined flour, and because it tends to be quote unquote preferred. And interesting statistical data that only 1 out of 10 adults and children in the US are eating the recommended amount of whole grain each day. So here is some example, but today with the whole grains can do a lot of different things. Not only they have plenty of food for your microbiome, they can be made into delicious burger buns, any breads that you currently have. It would help, drive more customers knowing if you're using a better for you flour. So part of the, my training, I was fortunate to be trained by a lot of cereal chemists with the American Association of Cereal Chemists. It's another association, and a lot of great work is being done. So a lot of my mentors have pushed me, and through the American Dietitian Association as well, there's a lot of work trying to promote better for you. And it's very difficult when we're used to one product and do it the same way. But again, only half of, you should at least eat half of the daily grain intake should be coming from whole grain. And again, it all depends, but they're great and they're an easy thing to do without having to bring any new equipment or any new processes to introduce whole grain within your environment. So let's look a little bit of the benefits. There's a lot of synergy when you bring the whole foods, as like any food, as soon as the food is whole, they get the thing, there's the halo of freshness associated with it. But for those looking at that, you're going to say, I'm not sure what it is. But a lot of the bringing the whole grain, there is amylase inhibitors. There is resistant starch, which is good to make it low carb. When you get a whole grain based on the fiber, you're going to automatically get less carbohydrate because you have less available sugar and then therefore easier to digest for the body. So you have a lot of stanols, antioxidants, and phytoestrogen, flavonoids. So you have a lot of benefits coming from the plant, and that's a slide that I know can be a little confusing, but it's a slide that was made, as a research purpose. So hopefully it's not too cumbersome for those of you watching, assisting the webinar. So I did mention several times phytonutrients. So the phytonutrients is a definition. It's basically part of the plants that have beneficial effects on health. And look it up and search it and try to investigate. And that's why on the previous slide, it's a little bit of a better explanation. Flavonoids, phenolic, and are all antioxidants. And antioxidants, and it's being used everywhere, it's preventing the aging process. So it keeps it fresh longer. So think of a lot of people putting moisturizer and cream on their face as antioxidants because we're trying to do that. So some of the food contains it. I think it's a great way to think of whole grain not being more than just flour. And on that note, there's a lot of myths around whole grain, and that I wrote down. The first whole myth, just to address as part of a conversation, where people will say whole grains are only for people trying to lose weight. And I think, no, whole grains are for everyone looking for another option. This is not just for people trying to get into a diet. Another thing is whole grains taste bad. They don't taste as good as a regular bread. And you won't be able to try the bread I will be demoing on the video for you. But I challenge anybody. I do believe that you can make it nutritious and delicious based on knowing how to use the grain and properly ferment it. So because they bring so many different options once you go expand from just wheat. So another myth is people will say, no, whole grains are more expensive. I did look it up for all of you yesterday on the webrestaurant.com, where you can buy, a bag of flour. The bag of flour for the enriched white flour was $36 for a 50-pound bag and $28 for a whole grain for the same equivalent with everything in. So to me, it's cheaper, it's better, and it allows you to create more trends. So I think, the benefits are here, and it's trying to educate with people like myself, educate the group, and hopefully get you interested in using whole grain. So there's an array of health benefits, and all of those, as you can see, I put some references on the bottom, but whole grains have been proven through research study to reduce the risk for heart disease and some cancers in adults. As you can see, it shows that risk of heart disease by 25 to 36%, because as you bring more whole grain, it's better for the body, for digestion, and I think for blood flow. And again, I'm not a doctor. I'm not talking about medical thing. And as you can see, then it continues. Whole grains also will prevent, help reduce the risk for stroke and diabetes, as you have less sugar. And for those who are involved in nutrition or involved with food or listening or interested, it's reference to the glycemic index, which means, the lower the number basically makes it longer to digest. It's sort of bad satiety. And that's one thing to maintain associated weight balances. When you eat good quality whole grain, the body takes longer to process it versus just refined flour where you'll be hungry 2 hours later. It's a process called satiety, so it makes you feel satiated much longer, and then you need less food. So it's about the nutrient-dense food versus just the food that is mostly carbohydrate to sugar that the body will process faster. So now enough of all the talks of whole grains and their benefits, and hopefully, I made a point with some of you. And it's a video I've made. I will describe it before we get into it. It'll be a video, and I will stop and talk to you over the video just to make sure that you if you have questions or some points of the changes of rheological changes as we're mixing it. It's a mix that I've created 4 years ago, and it's a blend of whole grain. So I'm using 2 different types of whole wheat. I'm using white wheat and red wheat, and they bring different flavors, same as chefs, you would go get your ingredients. I've also added some whole barley flour, similar to what it makes beer. It's great for texture. It's great for yeast, love it because it has a lot of good available sugar for them to ferment and give you the organic acids and the flavor development of a good bread. I've added a lot of hemp protein. I'm a big fan of hemp. I've been a big fan since it's been made as a GRAS ingredients under the FDA government back in 2019. I've baked quite extensively with it to increase the overall nutrition and digestibility of the product. And to that, I've added flax seeds, sunflower seeds, hemp seeds, and also added on this one some sprouted oats, whole oats. So you're getting for the equivalent of the burger buns that you'll see, the 80 grams burger buns, so which is roughly two ounces baked, two and a half ounces to 3 ounces. And that bun will deliver around 30 grams of protein, which is huge, about 60 grams of whole grain, which is enough for the daily intake that you need to take for the day with one bun. And on top of it, as you'll see, the texture is phenomenal. It's soft bite, great shelf life, and great texture. So without further ado, let's get started with the video. So here we have the whole grain mix. So, and you can see all the seeds are in there. To that, it's 500 grams of flour, 10 grams of salt, and 50 grams of sugar. 5 eggs. We're making a brioche style bun, fresh eggs, directly to the flour, and yeast. Let's not forget the yeast. There is 7 grams of dry instant yeast. And I'm using a Hobart, a small tabletop mixer. And as you can see here, you will get almost like a cake batter with the dough as you put the eggs. And right now, there is no liquid yet added to it. And the dough will be very soft. So what you do with whole grain, and the big difference in baking with whole grain is taking the time to, as you can see, compared to regular dough, the dough doesn't have the right body for it. And at that point, I did add about 50 grams of milk, and you can even add more. When working with whole grain, the difference versus a refined flour is the whole grain containing the fiber and the germ will need to absorb more water, but the rate at which they will absorb the liquid takes longer. And that's a big difference. Often, if you want to work with whole grain, for those who are used to the baking terminologies, you can use an autolyse. That means you could take your whole grain, no yeast, no salt, but with your water, just make a dough and let it sit. And 30 minutes, 45 minutes, sometimes people have done it overnight. It's up to you. But by doing so, you're allowing the whole grain to fully hydrate, giving you better results. So let's continue back to the video. Now I move to second speed. As you can see, because of all of the different brand germs and seeds, the gluten, and here, as you can see, the little white specks in there are the sprouted oat. And sprouted oat, also by sprouting grains, it brings extra nutrients and vitamins. So as you can see, the pickup where now the gluten is starting to come together. And remember, it's this very simple hook mixer that most restaurants have. And there's a phenomenon here as in bakeries, as we call it, cleanup. As you can see, as the gluten is forming, is basically the gluten network is forming within dough, is starting to, what we're doing from the mixing, we're introducing oxygen. And as the gluten becomes stronger, it's pulling all the dough from a soft dough to, soft on the side to now being a compact dough. And at that point, which took about 10 minutes of mix time, I'm adding butter, and which makes a brioche. And don't put your butter first, because if not, your dough, allow for your gluten to be hydrated. And what I've learned as techniques is when you add your fat after, it allows for first the gluten to develop first. And then now by adding the fat, now you're lubricating the gluten strain, making it more extensible and more elastic. So, and now you're going back to first speed, mixing and allowing for the butter to slowly get blended into the process. And now I'm going back into second speed. The overall mix time was about 21 minutes. So a brioche dough, a soft, rich dough, it's about building the network. If you don't do it properly, you will get something super flat. So at this point, when I look at the cleanup in the bowl to ensure that it's well mixed, and that's the point where I will stop. And so as you can see, the dough was just mixed, and you can see all the grain, and I have extensibility. So one thing for the brioche, I always like, it's another technique for those wanting to do brioche in your own shop or in your own restaurant into different buns, is allow for your brioche to ferment covered into a tub. Right here, I fermented it into the bowl, and I give it 12 hours overnight. So I put it about 8 o'clock at night. I came back 8 o'clock in the morning, and you can see the dough is going to be much firmer, because similar to when you take butter and you put it in the fridge, it has that, still firm but soft. So very similar because of the high amount of ingredients in there. So, and you often will give it one, based on the temperature in the environment, 1 to 2 hours of rest time till it comes back in temperature. You'll feel the dough. See, the dough is non-sticky, even though with all the ingredients, it has a really nice sort of darker color. So I did my buns at about 80 grams. and the dough felt really, really nice. And it's quite remarkable knowing, the amount of protein that you get in and still getting a good quality product. I always like to take my bun after they're being rounded and use a rolling pin, as you can see all the seeds in there, and flatten them up. And I'm using, as you know, zero flour or dusting flour. And I didn't have any problems. So now those will go and be fermented on the proof box for 50 minutes to an hour. And right there, I actually wanted to see that that's one thing when you want to know if a dough is properly mixed, especially with whole grain, is when you put your finger and you press slightly, don't press too hard, and it bounces back slightly, slowly, that means it's ready. If it bounces back, it leaves a little dead, it's ready. If it bounces back and comes back to its full shape, it's underproof. And if you press and it collapses, then it's overproofed. It's all the touch and feel that the bakers and we learn in the trade. But those are ready to go. And I didn't have any egg wash, so I said, let's put a cream in there. So this is a cream, and a cream will give you, because it contains a lot of different lactose. It's similar to sugar. And I thought that would be good to show that, hey, if you're looking for a different look, you could have, made those buns and sprinkle sesame seeds, so top them from however you want it. But you can see, and those are the baked result. They really got a nice expansion, really nice volume. And what's nice is they didn't collapse and they expanded perfectly. And I'm going to cut one open. You'll be able to see. And we made beautiful burgers and sandwiches with it, even for breakfast. And what's unique, it's really the flavor and the texture, similar to like a craft beer. If you want to attract your customer, you'll see the inside of the bun. And the key detail to a bun is the structure. If you use some type of a baguette with a lot of the open cell crumb structure, then the sauce will go through. And if you put it in mayonnaise or something like that, or the cheese or in the juices of a good burger, it will go through. So now with that, I've been able to perfect it where it's really holding it well. And when you're eating your burger, there's nothing worse than having a bun and the whole bun is falling apart. That one is really sturdy. So that's the finished product. As you can see, all the seeds. And what's nice, and with all the different inclusions that you get it to your product, it will allow for a really nice different textural differences, especially with the sunflower in there. And you don't want to put too much of that where all of a sudden you're not, you're breaking the structure. It's finding the fine balance of, once you make bread, and especially as you're going into making breads with whole grain, making bread and getting a nice texture and volume, it's about building the structure. It's like a deck of cards. Your gluten is what supports the house, and the more ingredients you put in, the more difficult it is to support the house. But if you play, and it's my experience, it's not something that can be done overnight, but I'll be happy to help those who have, later on, who have questions, is think of whole grain and think of grain as a way to really bring new innovative products to your menu offering. You look at all the places selling sandwiches, and often it's always the same. So try to set yourself from the rest of the competition by either finding a local bakery that could have a good bread program, or talk to your local baker to be like, hey, can you develop a better for you, or using a whole grain? You can use 100% whole grain, whole flour, and try to do it. But often I found that it's not enough. And by blending other grains and knowing their functionality or the nutritional benefits and how they can benefit your finished product in terms of texture, shelf life, etc., is always the best. So now I've, we for chefs try to put different options. Even when you're doing breading of chicken, you could still be blending different whole grains and experimenting to see if you can get different textures, flavor. I've never done, but you can make a donut with whole grain. I've done it. Everything that you do currently with a regular white refined flour can be done with a whole grain. All it takes is remembering that whole grains containing, the bran and a germ will often require more water because those extra ingredients will need to be hydrated in order to be, palatable. And baking is nothing but taking a raw commodity ingredients and transforming it into a finished product. Same as the chef will take ingredients and turning it into a meal. Same as the brewer will take some grain, fermenting it and making it into a beer. So it's rethinking of that. Use a lot of, for those experimenting with whole grains and wanting to go a step further, it's amazing when you work with sourdough fermentation. And just wanted to briefly touch for those aspiring bakers or people interested in baking at home. It's sourdough is compared to a regular yeast that you get into, you buy with your flour and your ingredients. Yeast will come in either active dry, instant, or fresh. And the active dry requires a pre-hydration process, 90-degree water with some sugar, no sugar, milk, no milk, for about 15 minutes until it foams up. Then you use it. The instant, the difference versus the active can be used directly into your dry mix, like you've seen in the example video. And the yeast, I had already added the yeast into it with the sugar and the salt. So it means it's an easy, quick step. And sourdough fermentation is when using a natural, what I call a wild yeast. And often the difference with those is they allow for different style of fermentation because being wild, there are over, from what I heard, about 10,000 different species of wild yeast you can use. And an interesting fact is yeast are nothing else than a fungi, a mushroom. So it's in the same family. They're cousins. They're related. So it's how you're using, your yeast, how you're using your ingredients. And I understand it's the difference to a lot of my good friends who are chefs. It's in a restaurant. It's a fast pace. Baking is about giving it the time and waiting and taking the time to ensure, you're getting the right result. So that's basically everything that I wanted to cover with you today. Thank you very much for listening, and please keep on baking and don't be afraid to bring whole grains into your restaurant and try something different tomorrow.
Thank you, Chef. That was so much fantastic information that you just shared. We have some questions coming in. The first one is about the dough that you just demoed, the brioche, and if it can be used to make pizza dough, and if or if not, do you have any whole grain pizza dough suggestions?
Yes. Well, just to give you excellent question, just see the flour I use in that video, I've actually used it to make almost anything you can imagine within the bakery world. I've made a great pizza. And the advantage of it is I was able to get a really nice texture and a very different flavor. And I was showcasing that at the Bakery Expo in Atlantic City, the Pizza Expo, and everybody liked it. So just to get a study. But if you do it, remember the key is it's a different hydration. So, and how do you bake it? if you bake it at the same temperature, now you have more water, it might get gummy. So you have to rethink of how you mix it, how you hydrate it, and how you bake it. And it's by just changing the dials on those small things, you can create amazing products.
Thank you. We have some questions about the recipe formula percentages. And one of the questions is using more yeast important with whole grains to give it more lift just because there's less gluten in the product? Or
very good point. Often you do have to use a little more yeast, but yeast, regardless as an ingredient, it's a living organism. So if it's in a good environment, they'll keep on producing and keep on generating and budding and creating carbon dioxide, which what gives you the lift. So that means it's the yeast amount you're using is about the amount of time you have. And usually bakers tend to figure out how much yeast do I have based on the process they have. So if you only have 2 to 3 hours, just put enough yeast. So, you don't want to be staying all night long to wait for your pizza or your bread to be risen or leavened. It's going to be about that. But remember, the more yeast, there's one thing that, especially the industrial, what I call the yeast you buy, the Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the little packets of yeast, the more you put into a product, that has it's a great product, but if you put too much, it also has a negative effect where it dries up your bread quicker. So it's good to know. And there are ways around it, which is not a topic, but put the amount of yeast you want based on the time you have. So that'll be the answer.
Great, thank you. Such a careful balance.
Yes.
We also have a question here. Obviously, with the brioche, you were applying that to a more savory application, using it for a burger bun, let's say. Do you have recommendations for whole grains being applied on the sweet side of things?
Yep, that formula that you saw instead of what you could have done, and that would be great. I would go almost with what I call the Viennese style bread, and instead of putting the eggs, you would have not put any eggs, but added milk to it, and at the end put some small mini count chocolate chip, and it makes a wonderful, wonderful bread. And where I grew up too, we used to, make it with the pearl sugar that not really found here, but you find in Belgium, and they have very large count, and it's crunchy. And we used to make a brioche with it, and I'm telling you, if you do a brioche with that, I know it's sweet on sweet, but regardless, it's a real treat and really worth trying. So any addition of inclusions that you're thinking of that want to be added to it, and that's what's good, because it can really accompany almost anything from savory to sweet, and it's not overdone. And the eggs and of course the sugar and the fat helped change the overall texture. But regardless, I make the same bread as a loaf with no sugar and no fat added, where make a great avocado toast in the morning, or jam and jelly. So whatever your choice is.
Great, thank you. Just going back to basics, just so everyone's on the same page, because we have a couple questions here. Can you just go back and explain the difference between refined flour and then what is defined as whole grain flour?
Yep. So whole grain, as the name entails, it's the whole thing. It's like whole foods, whole grain. That means it's the endosperm, the bran, and the germ. So nothing has been separated or removed. As soon as we're talking about refined grains, and it's where they removed in the milling process the germ and the bran, which, as stated, is the nutritional part, and often are being fortified with enriched vitamins that are being added after removed. And just the one quick point, and it's we're talking about upcycling and sustainable, and there's a lot of talks about it. If you want to be truly upcycling and sustainable, use the whole grain, because why separate something that in nature is as a whole, and when you can still make good products with it?
Great. We actually have a question here about sustainability. and recommendations of other, not necessarily wheat options, but other sustainable grain options that you would recommend?
And sustainable grain option, it would be anything that is a whole. I know within the upcycling, a sustainable movement, I've seen a lot of bakers tapping into, which is a great idea, going into the beer industry, where they take the spent grains that are used for brewing, and often the grain is a barley that's going through a process to allow to derive the sugar, so the yeast can create the fermentation that makes the beautiful beverage that you enjoy at the barbecue in the summer. And those grains are being used, reused, and retransformed into a flour. I've played with it. They're great. They're limited because from the price standpoint, it gets a little higher up because there's an extra process. You know, it's often difficult, and the sort of the gray area, people say, hey, you know, upcycling, sustainability is great, but often they have to retransform that to a product that was destined to the trash. But it's a lot of great movement. So if you want to be in upcycling, I'll give you an example. I've seen bakeries reusing some of their leftover breads and turning that into cookies. I've seen leftover bread that we usually will go into the garbage, where they went a step further. They're making a beer. It was somewhere in Europe. So there's a lot of creative ways to push the sustainable movement, and think about, it's a USDA statistic. You can check it out online. Every year we're wasting between 30 to 40% of the food we manufacture gets down to the garbage. So there's a lot that can be done from all of us professionals involved in the food. I'm not saying we have to change the system, but we have to be creative in ways that we can reuse things to make great products.
Thank you. There's a labeling question here about when you have a whole grain product, do you know what percentage of whole grain ingredients have to be in it for it to be considered whole grain when it's on the market?
There's a lot of conversation for labeling. The best will be to go to the Whole Grain Council. There's a lot of wonderful information you can find through the Whole Grain Council about how to do it. And if you're putting on a label, the whole grain goes with a definition that I went through. What constitutes a whole grain? And then they'll verify with formulation. You can buy a stamp for your product that says made with whole grain. And then you have different level. So it could be made with 100%, made with 75%, made with 50%, I think maybe made with 25%, but it means you're still contributing to the whole grain claim, and you're promoting whole grain for your product. But the Whole Grain Council would be your best avenue to find, the proper information for your packaging claim.
Thank you. Chef, you have so much passion and knowledge about the use of whole grain. So I'd love to know how you got started in experimenting with more whole grains and what got you started on this journey towards whole grains.
I only take 2 minutes. I'm passionate. I'm really passionate about baking. I started in the bakery industry. I sort of fell into it around the age of 10. I fell in love with it, and I never stopped. I've been into it for 35 years. And over the course of my career as a master baker, I always tried to become better and learn more and more and more and more. So I've been, for the last 15, 16 years, researching the history of bread. I do collect antique books. And one of my oldest books is from the 17th century, an original written in French. So, and looking back to see what is bread and what does that mean to, bread, we've all heard, it says the staff of life. And I've always been intrigued. I've done, like I said, 16 years of research to see the evolution of bread and what we're eating. So my passion for whole grain is, if you look for all of our ancestors, we used to bake at home. And in the US, we sort of stopped around the 1930s when sliced bread came on board. If you look at data, 90% of the bread being consumed in the US before 1930s was made at home. People will make their bread fresh every day. And once the sliced bread came on board, it really turned the industry all around when 90% of the bread consumed were being bought by industrial bakeries. So in the quest of mankind since the beginning of commercial bakery comes from ancient Egypt, where they were, given the title of discovering the first leavened bread by leaving an old piece of dough on the side. I started leavening and I said, let's use that and reuse it for our dough. But if you see through history, there's a big push where most of the white bread were reserved for higher caste society. And if you look at Wonder Bread was able to deliver the white bread for everybody, where in society over the generation and how all of our ancestors used to consume bread, we were given a lot of bread to consume with the rye, and basically what I'm talking about, a lot of the nutritional bread, because going to the grocery store was not really an easy thing to do because they had none, they didn't have running water. There's a lot of limitations of how you could do it. And bread was basically a staple. You add too nutrient rich with germs and bread, very dense, almost like German style, with some butter or some cheese. And that was your meal until dinner. And again, satiety and that type of bread will make them, have the energy to go do your labor work in the farm. I think, today, that's what I'm, as people rethink of diet, that's why I'm a big believer. And I've got great mentors over my career where people who taught me that, by doing proper fermentation and having a right mix of whole grain, this is as good as a meal because you're getting all the protein. If you think on the bun, like I said, about 30 grams of protein, that's the equivalent of 4 eggs. An egg is about 6 grams of protein. So it's a lot of way of rethinking of nutrition, but through grain. And that's what I hope, and then my research, that's what I keep on promoting. I'm not saying everybody has to change, everybody has a different preference, but overall it's great opportunities for innovation. And especially with the growing market of the Gen Z, where they're more conscientious about sort of the better for you. And I think it creates opportunities for all of us.
Thanks. Such a wonderful perspective when looking at the history of these baking trends, which leads us, I think, to one of our last questions coming up here as we have, what are your takes on what might be trends moving forward with bread in the next year or two?
Yep, I'll give you what I I'll share a quick story. When I started in about 20, I was on the plane working for a big milling company at the time, and I sat next to an older gentleman, and lo and behold, he was working for the brewing industry. And as we were chatting, because I love fermentation, as you can hear, we're talking about fermentation because bread and brewing are very close cousin. And actually, as a little fact, most of the bakers used to be around brewing because that's how they could get their yeast. And because there's no other way, you couldn't get Cisco to deliver it to you at that time. So we were chatting about the trends and the world of baking. And he said to me, which I will always remember, he said, if you want to know the trend of the bakery industry, he said, just look at the brewing industry. And so I was a little perplexed. And I sort of stopped and said, why is that? He said, if you look historically speaking, that's why I love history, because you find that you realize everything tends to be cyclical. That in the brewing industry, in America, in around the 1910 and before the Prohibition, a lot of the people were drinking beer every day because you didn't have any running water, you didn't have bottled water, so everybody drank beers, kids drank beers, and a lot of the basically institution at the time, there were 2, Pabst and Bud. So those were the two major companies basically selling everything. And over the years after the prohibition, they kept on doing that. But what happened is, as in the 60s and 70s, all the, around there, they tried to, have the same beer for everyone. And Americans were getting tired of having the same thing. And all of a sudden, what they did is because the beer manufacturers were getting the super brewing company, and they would brew a lot of beers, high volume, and distribute it everywhere. But it was a time when craft brewing was coming along, and craft brewing was like Sam Adams, where now people were willing to say, hey, this is different. Hey, this is an experience. Then people were willing to spend. And around the 80s, the market flipped around. So going back to the quote from that very kind gentleman, is if you follow the beer industry, what we're starting to see is more and more people, especially since COVID, are aware of what they eat. And they seem to be, we're conscientious about microbiome, you are what you eat, and how certain food makes us feel. So, and if you look at the state of the bakery industry, today, 95% of bread we consume in the US are being made by industrial bakers. And the amount of retail bakers or artisan bakers is around 5 to 7%. So it's not a big amount. So it's a small quantity. So what I hope us to see as a trend, and what I'm projecting, and again, it's a hope, is similar to the brewing industry, that consumers are going to start, and I'm seeing it in urban areas. That's where often trends are starting, where you have small bakeries making sourdough bread and artisan bread, where now consumers, I was at a local bakery in Philadelphia, and where you see young people walking out with baguettes and breads and taking it home versus buying it at a grocery store. So once consumers are going to see more options and more available, better for you, a higher quality product, it doesn't mean that's what we will be eating every day, similar to the brewing industry. But let's face it, now nobody thinks twice about going into a restaurant doing brewing and spending $8, $9, $10 for a glass of beer. As back in the 1970s, that would have been impossible. So same thing is happening today in the US. We're seeing consumers looking for a better value, because not better value in terms of price, but a better value in terms of available nutrient and how people relate to the product. And I think, just start thinking of bread not just as something to make a sandwich, but bread is also an ingredient, and bread is also something that can replace a meal if it's done properly. So I hope that in the future, the near future, we'll see an uptake of more artisanal bakers and more people willing to support artisanal bakers and spending more money because they'll realize that the quality makes them feel better.
Thank you so much, Chef, for all of this information. It was a great combination of history, science, and techniques all in one. So thank you so much for being here today at this ACF forum.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you to the ACF and the RBA.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both. I wish we had 4 more hours. This has just been so interesting and really great information. So a huge virtual round of applause as we thank Chef Richard and Chef Marissa. And of course, thank you to the RBA. We appreciate you more than you can imagine, taking the time to share your skills and enthusiasm for the baking craft. And I know that the future bakers and the culinary professionals and pastry chefs tuning in today have very, very much appreciated. Please be on the lookout for the survey that you'll receive today or tomorrow, along with the recording, which you'll need to complete in order to earn your 1 hour of ACF CEH. And we'll be back for our next webinar on May 15th for a session on healthy habits and work-life balance presented by the ACF Young Chefs Club. And mark your calendars for June 1st, when we'll have the opportunity to learn about plant-forward appetizers with certified master chef Tim Bucci. Please visit acfchefs.org and hit the events tab to register for ACF National Convention. We're headed to New Orleans, July 16th through 19th. And we're also excited to announce our 2023 ACF Mastercraft Summit Series. So definitely mark your calendars for these one-day educational programs. On our Culinary Educator Summit will be held July 16th at the New Orleans Convention Center on the pre-day of ACF National Convention. And then we'll have our Culinary Medicine Summit in Kalamazoo, Advanced Culinary Summit in Palm Beach, and the Advanced Pastry Summit in Charlotte. So on behalf of the ACF National Office, thank you again to Richard and to Marissa. Thank you for tuning in today to this delicious learning opportunity. And thank you again to the RBA. See you all soon. Have a great day, everyone.